Welcome, everybody. Today's session, which I'm very excited to be moderating, will be exploring the topic of how the public sector can sustain some of the dramatic transformations that we have seen during the pandemic going forward beyond the immediate crisis in which we're all currently immersed. I'm going to dive right in to get things going by asking everybody in the audience to submit their response to our poll question right away. So our poll question is, after the pandemic, will we return to, quote, business as usual, or is the pandemic inducing sustainable, resourced, and long-standing innovations in governance that will endure in the decades to come? So you have those two options to choose from, and you can answer the poll in the poll column that is in the event platform. So my name is Amanda Clarke. I'm an associate professor at Carleton University's School of Public Policy and Administration in Ottawa, Canada. And as I say, I will be moderating our conversation today. During this session, I really encourage everybody to get involved in the chat, to ask and upvote questions on the other columns in the app, and also to tweet along using the hashtag GovAfterShock. So a bit about where this event comes from. So Government Aftershock is an experiment that the OECD has run in collective learning and an effort to make sense of the crisis, really to understand the implications that the pandemic will have on the institution of government. So over 60 events related to Government Aftershock have been run by different groups around the world in the lead up to today. And all of this work has been united and focused on really three central questions. First, what should we leave behind after the pandemic in terms of governance and the management of the state? Second, what should we keep? And third, what should we really do differently given what we've learned throughout this crisis? So other sessions in today's forum are going to explore different angles of what that crisis will mean going forward. But this session is very much focused on the question of how we can sustain the good things we've seen. So the waves of innovation and transformation that have, in a sense, been unlocked by the crisis. So our goal is really to look forward at how we can keep momentum. So the OECD's Innovative Responses Tracker, which you can find online, has captured over 430 innovative responses to the pandemic, ranging across a whole range of policy areas and functions and services. Some of these innovations, such as the shift to sort of widespread remote working or work from home arrangements, telehealth, some of these things, have already been kind of well in the works in certain countries for years. In other cases, we saw what seemed to be sort of a miraculous ability to shift into areas and ways of working that have long been called for by practitioners and by those who study government. Things like de-siloing the state, encouraging more collaboration across policy areas, greater engagement of stakeholders, raising the risk tolerance of public sector institutions in order to enable innovation. And the classic complaint of the need to reduce administrative burden and create space for entrepreneurial public servants to make real change. So I think the real question is, why did it take a crisis to push these things over the line? And are we really reliant on crises to make change happen in the public sector? If so, how can we build reserve capacity such that innovation can become more of a default in how governments run and not something that only arises in the case of crises such as global pandemics? So today's discussion will really contribute to the development of a call to action that the OECD is going to be developing for governments around the world. That brings me to our panel today. I'm really delighted to be joined by our esteemed participants and panelists who will help us explore how, or even if, we can really sustain public sector transformation beyond this crisis. So first we have Juhani Damski, who is Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of the Environment, joining us from Finland. Teresa Gerton is President and CEO of the US National Academy of Public Administration, joining us from the United States. Marta Arsovska Tomovska is Director of Team for Public Administration Reform at the Office of the Prime Minister in Serbia. And last but not least, we have Robert Watt, Secretary General of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, who's joining us today from Ireland. So welcome to our panelists. I'll now turn it over to you. We should have our poll results, and I'll ask each of you to take 3 minutes to introduce yourself and also to comment on these on the response to the poll to give us a sense of also what the crisis has revealed to you thus far. So just to give a sense of the results. 14.3% or 2 responses suggested that, in fact, business as usual. Overwhelmingly, it seems that those chiming in and listening in today believe that we are going to see sustainable, resourced, and long-standing innovation that will endure. So we have a positive crew with us today. So over to you. I'll begin with Terry.
Well, thanks, Amanda. It's such a pleasure to be here with everybody. As Amanda mentioned, I'm the president of the National Academy of Public Administration in the United States, and that is one of only 2 congressionally chartered public academies in the United States. We focus on bringing the expertise of our fellows of the Academy to government leaders at all levels to help them solve challenges in public administration. And I'm really encouraged by the positive thought of the poll that there will be enduring change. We held an event yesterday as part of the Aftershock conversation, and we have a group that the Academy co-sponsors called the Agile Government Center, and we have an Agile Government Network of folks from around the world thinking about how to bring agile practices to government. And one of the key takeaways from our conversation yesterday was that the steps to prepare for a future crisis, because we all know that there will be one, really need to be a combination of 3 things that we especially find challenging. One is that they need to be international. One is that they need to be intergovernmental, that is between all of our levels of government, and one that they need to be interagency. And to Amanda's point earlier, breaking down government silos to really develop collaborative solutions. And the 4th piece of that is that it's so important to include the public in the process so that we can build trust and buy-in to solutions in advance. And I'm sure in our conversations today, we'll be dealing with the issues of public trust in government and how that affects our ability to really drive change and what motivates change. I'll just put out there for the audience that the Academy has developed an agenda of what we call 12 grand challenges in public administration. Those are on our website at napawash.org. And we really envision that as a 10-year agenda to help address these issues of preparedness and resilience in our communities and in our government. And we've specifically developed some action plans for our new presidential administration to help drive progress in those spaces and in those challenges for the coming year as they get settled into leadership. So it's an interesting time in the US. And we'll talk a little bit more, I think, as we go on about the challenges of really institutionalizing some of these changes in a complex system so that we can be prepared for the future. But I'll stop there and give everyone else a chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Juhani, would you like to jump in with your thoughts?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. Greetings from Finland. I'm actually working from my summer house right now, although it's very much November-ish here in Finland. That was a very nice summary that was given, and I'd like to add a couple of points there, perhaps starting from the science. I think that this shock or the crisis is very much the solutions for the crisis are very much based on the science. And I'd like to very much underline that we have to work also for getting science for our help when making governmental decisions, and the overall the governmental hierarchy and everything should be based on solid science. One other thing that I would like to add here is that, of course, we have to work together. We have to trust each other. It's intergovernmental, it's interagencies, and also gives, it has to be done when we are doing the legislation, when we are making new legislation that's probably needed because of the crisis. And also, I'd like to underline that we need to make our solutions sustainable in terms of environment, climate, and biodiversity. And there are lots of things that we have to think about. And of course, since I'm from the Ministry of Environment, these are very important, but they are also underlined in a number of other issues. So in order to do so, we have to understand the root reasons, and the resilience was a very nice word that was already used, and I'd like to end with the resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juhani. So actually, there was a slight issue with the poll. It actually looks like our early sense of enthusiasm might have been dampened slightly. So actually, with a few more responses coming in, we actually have about a third of our participants who are now saying that this is business as usual. 2/3 are saying, you know, this is sustainable resource, things are going to change moving forward. So I don't know how that changes things for our participants, but certainly a little less rosy perhaps, but that's just more food for thought. So that's great. Robert, I'll pass it over to you to hear your thoughts on the poll question and also to introduce you and your work.
Well, thanks, Amanda. I guess you have to count all the votes. So wait till all the votes are in. I guess is one of the lessons from recent times. So I'm Robert Watts, Secretary General of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform in Ireland. So I'm responsible for the Treasury function in the Irish government, and also responsible for driving reform in the civil service and the wider public service in a whole variety of different areas. So in terms of the question, the poll question, I think many of the changes, as other colleagues have said, will endure. Remote working or some form of blended remote working, the greater collaboration, I think, across public service bodies in response to the crisis, digitalization, many of the changes you see in the health service in terms of remote healthcare and so forth. I think many of those things will endure because I think we've all seen the enormous benefits and because they're popular and they're effective amongst employees and also from the recipients of services. I think people ultimately want to engage with government at a time that suits them, when it's convenient for them, and digitalization and all those reforms we're all engaging with helps people to do that. So I think we will. The question is, can we sustain the change? And that's a more fundamental question on what type of changes do we need to meet the challenges of the future. And I think it comes down to a number of different factors. I think firstly, do citizens trust government, and will they trust this bigger government that we all now have? And I think it's useful to look back at the parallels with the great financial crisis, because back then trust in government fell amongst most OECD countries, amongst most countries in the developed world. We've all seen, I think, a steady recovery in trust in institutions, not across all countries, but in the main, across many countries. The question is, after this crisis, how will citizens look back at the performance of government in 3-6 months' time? Will they think we've done well? That will differ by country, but I think that will ultimately impact upon people's perceptions of government and our ability then to sustain changes and to sustain a type of government that meets people's needs. And related to that, of course, to sustain changes and momentum for reform and innovation, I think we need political leadership. We need the political system to support change, of course, but we also need the administrative leadership, and strong leaders with strong values being given the opportunity to build up capacity in their institutions. So it's really about those values and capacity. And do we have the ambition? Are we ambitious for the future? And do we have leaders who share those ambitions? So I think to sum up, Amanda, I think many of the changes will endure, but whether we can sustain innovation into the future, I think that's much more of an open question. We seem to be very good at making changes during crisis, but normal business for us may not always be as entrepreneurial or as dynamic or as innovative as we would all like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. So another, I think, big call out for the question of an issue of citizen trust, which I think will be an enduring theme throughout our conversation today. Last, I'll throw the question to Marta to hear her thoughts and to introduce her work.
So good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Serbia. My name is Marta Arsovska Tomovska. I'm the director of the Public Administration Reform Team and also Prime Minister's advisor for digitalization and innovation. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I really would like to congratulate to OECD for this collective, let's say, exercise where we could try to potentially draw some call for action. just to start with, we had a great session this morning when was the kickoff of this high-level forum, where the Prime Minister of Serbia, Ana Brnabić, basically opened the forum together with the Secretary General of the OECD, Mr. Guria, and they had a very sincere and honest conversation about what is going on and where the world is and governments are going. As we approach almost a full year living with COVID and still not being, unfortunately, out of the woods, I see this event as a great opportunity to pause and to reflect. Why do we need to reflect? Because if we reflect and we draw some conclusions, we will be better prepared for the future. So what the future holds, basically, many of us are still digesting and alternating between the hope of returning to the good old normal and the notion of permanent changes, like, you know, somebody is chasing us. So I guess the answer lies somewhere between these two extremes. But what I do, I always advocate that we should not predict the future, but instead being prepared for all scenarios. Which means for me, and this is my advisor's role, that first every organization, including government, should imagine itself as an organization which is agile and flexible to change, to do small experiments and which sometimes succeed, sometimes not, but still like entering into a startup mode, let's say. The second step would be to make a very honest assessment of the current situation and how, and in relation to the target situation. And the third would be to see what capacities and human and technological and what are the partnerships that we have to build and which segments we should specialize to achieve that flexibility. So the positive outcome of the poll, which goes in line with those, let's say, advice, it's extremely positive because we need that optimism now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of ideas on the table now. I'm going to jump into some questions that we've prepared in advance to pose to our panelists before opening it up to some of the questions that our participants have offered. And I would again encourage those participating in this session to offer up your questions and to vote on questions in the app. So the first question that I wanted to dig into a little bit further, is with the significant change that we've seen in the public sector in a relatively short period of time, I think, one of the burning questions that many of us have who are working in government or who are observing government is, why did it take a crisis to bring these things to a head? There's been overwhelming evidence to suggest that things like teleworking and telehealth, for example, or the shift to more collaborative service design, to being more agile, to engaging stakeholders, to thinking of the user experience and really trying to meet target populations where they are. I mean, these are not new ideas, yet it took so long, and it took this massive crisis that brought the world to its knees in many ways for them to hit the agenda. So if you could give us some insight based on the work that you're all doing on, maybe setting the stage on some of those historical barriers that meant these were challenging innovations to put forth, that maybe we did need a crisis or so to just give us a bit of a sense of like why this was so hard to do historically. Does anybody want to jump in first, or would you like me to? I asked Terry to go first last time, so this time I'll begin with Robert.
Thanks, Amanda. I think there are many reasons why change doesn't happen, and even in areas where we see the enormous benefits. I think the first question is bandwidth. Change, particularly for large hierarchical organizations, adopting new technology requires bandwidth. And in public service organizations, there are many demands placed on us, and it's very hard for full-time officials like myself, for example, to say to politicians, well, that's not a priority, this is a priority. And it's very hard for us to really focus on the key things, because many ways we're bombarded with with the response to the latest issue of the day. So it's very hard for us to stick with a consistent program of change and reform, and that consistency is needed. So I think partly it's a function of the political world in which most of us operate, which can make it difficult. I think secondly, vested interests. Reform involves challenge. It involves doing things differently. It involves affecting the economic interests of groups or making life more difficult for certain groups. And those vested interests can't always mount a response to stopping necessary changes, which will provide benefits for the public at large or citizens. The benefits, of course, are dispersed, where the cost of the losses are concentrated into small groups who have to change their work practices or who may lose their job or may have to move to a different type of working. So I think it's a combination of bandwidth and vested interests. And I think finally, there's risk aversion in the public service, and many of our colleagues on the call will know that if you make a mistake, the way this is dealt with in a public sphere through parliamentary committees or inquiries can lead people to be very risk averse. In the private sector, what would happen is, the board might give you a rap on the knuckles, do better next time, we'll move on to the next issue. So I think it's part of our culture where all the time we're trying to move to more of a learning culture rather than a gotcha culture. But unfortunately, sometimes we have too much of the gotcha culture. So I think that those issues are always there when it comes to us trying to drive change and be innovative. And I know many colleagues on this call will be familiar with those sort of things because we have debated them a lot in the OECD over the years. But I think they're still there. And a good crisis, of course, a crisis, awful as this crisis is, as of course has enabled us to kick away many of those barriers, many of those resistors to reform. But sustaining it into the future, of course, Amanda, is a different challenge and may require different skills from all of us. Thank you.
Juhani, do you have thoughts on this question?
Yes, thank you. I think that there is no single reason for why we didn't do it before the crisis. In Finland, we didn't have the bandwidth sort of challenge. We had it already there. The technology was there. And I guess that most of the people were also able to use it, and they had it, but it just was not there as an everyday practice. And to me, I think that there were a number of reasons why we didn't do that, and the small reasons, they sort of add up and then made the barrier that we didn't start doing work from home and all these things before. But I think that in Finland, especially, the very strong kick from the government and from the politicians and the leadership was the final sort of kick that gave the sort of opened the dam, and everything was started to sort of fit into the place, and that was very important. But it was also very important that we had this kind of preparedness beforehand for this kind of situation. So there were plenty of plans for everything, and we were able to use those. Of course, I can't say that we just snapped on and then started working from home, but there was a lot of building blocks already there that we didn't maybe even realize, and I don't see how we can not see them anymore. So they are really there, and everything can be done with this framework as well, and I think that we have sort of got back our effectiveness as well. But of course there are dimensions that we have to take care, and the resilience and the social dimension is also very important. So there is still a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Marta, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question as well.
Well, I was thinking more about, generally speaking, the change within the change within the public sector as a whole to be more entrepreneurial, not necessarily meaning the digital, like telehealth and teleworking, basically the digital services as a whole. So I think that there were several reasons why we are seeing this change. One of the reasons is the entrepreneurial mindset, because in the time of crisis, when some bureaucrats say that something cannot be done, then other bureaucrats ask why. And it suddenly became so obvious that the force behind many rules is basically the habit, and that's not the law. because we had a burning platform to change that, and we changed the cultural aversion to risk. Actually, some of the employees said that it feels better to work for the government in those times of crisis because they got clear directions on how to achieve their mission, and they got the autonomy to bring decision on the first line, which they didn't have before. Because fighting a crisis is a sport, is a team sport, and everybody wants to become part of the team, and we broke the silos that otherwise existed between governments, and we kind of replaced the slow-moving and kind of territorial communication and reporting and those kind of things to a very, let's say, fast decision, small teams, dynamic teams, developing ideas together, taking ownership and leadership and praising for that leadership, which is something related to motivation that we didn't have. The governments basically reorganized themselves from, being stable and dynamic in the same times by establishing different kind of task forces that we've seen. So, they are more agile to instead of the traditional and slow ones. And because we had to innovate everything from the office sanitation to remote citizen interaction. That's for the part side of the government, and on the demand side of the citizens, suddenly the question why are these digital services? Why is this, let's say, telehealth important? Now the citizens get the idea that clearly and deeply understand that this is something that they need, and they had to, let's say, we got potential adopters of the digital and the digital technologies. The old concepts didn't work anymore. So bureaucracy and long-term planning didn't work anymore, and we pushed out of the comfort zone. We all have to adapt. And I said, and that's my motto, we changed our culture, we changed our mindset, and we kind of reshifted in a startup mode.
So I think that point you raised about sort of the motivation, the crisis, I think there's a real human side of this, these individual public servants who, as you say, as much as this is a sort of an awful time to be living in a sense, there is maybe a sense of real purpose for many of those kind of working in bureaucracies. Perhaps one of the insights there is that going forward, maybe we need to think about how we can motivate that same sense of urgency and importance for the range of challenges that governments face, whether that be climate change or reducing inequality, because arguably those could easily be framed as sort of big issues that might motivate public servants to want to be part of this entrepreneurial team. So that's great insight. Thank you very much, Marta. Terry, I'd love to hear your thoughts and your perspective on this question in particular from your position working at the National Academy of Public Administration. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Amanda. And I just want to reemphasize so many of the responses of my fellow panelists here. I'm very much aligned with Robert and his points about risk aversion of the government and vested interests that sort of mitigate against change. One other thing related to bandwidth is sort of attention span, right? We know that we're supposed to be planning in advance and doing our risk management assessments, and we get excited about that, and we get really vested in that for a while, but it's hard to sustain that interest and the funding for contingency planning for a long period of time. And so that makes it hard to change over time. But I am encouraged and aligned here with Marta on the idea of agility and pilot programs that start to drive change. I think one of the things we saw, certainly across the federal level and in our states, is that there had been a lot of pilot programs going on for a while related to some of these transformations in business processes and in work practices. And so there were things in the pipeline that were being developed and being practiced. And what the pandemic really did for us was release funding and break down some scale barriers, so that these things that people had been working on in small groups and in small instances were able to go to scale very quickly. And so I think that's a practice that we are probably going to want to take forward is to encourage that agility in an ongoing way, so that we're constantly developing new ideas and practices. We may not get them to scale until there's a big crisis and a release of funds and opportunity, but having them in the pipeline is so important to rapid response in a crisis situation.
Great, thank you very much. For the next question, I wanted to focus on what we see is not necessarily the sort of easy wins, but like the changes that have taken place, which we're pretty confident are now here going to stay. So, you know, the first question, we really got into some of these very thorny, long-standing barriers to change and innovation in the public sector, which I think justifiably are having most of us ask, well, this is an interesting time, but can it really last? I mean, it's very much up in the air. But there are clearly some things that we've seen change which are not going to go away. Robert mentioned, for example, work from home. I mean, I think at least the sentiment from Canada is very much like, yes, that's not going to go away. Maybe not to the extent it is now, but it's definitely going to become part of normal operating procedures in government. So I'd be really curious to hear what our panelists see from their perspective, from their from the work they're doing. What are the changes that have taken place during the crisis that, yeah, like there's very little doubt that is now part of how government works. So maybe we'll begin with Juhani on this one.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me start by, identifying that, for example, the bank is not anymore a building, and the working place is not anymore a building either. And we know that number of things that we used to do is not anymore as it was. So there is a lot of things that we have to identify in order to get to the next level. But then again, I think that the government here is perhaps should look after the best practices, for example, that is taking place on the private sector, where they are perhaps sometimes quite efficient in taking new ideas and innovative ideas of working practices, and also the practices what they're doing and their business models as well. So I think that we have to be open. We have to be we have to have courage to go to the next level, but it means that we really have to have trust on each other, and of course this is that the situation is such that we haven't ever been there before, so it's new for everybody. So therefore learning from each other is also very important. But do we get back to this mode where we still have a building as a working place and the process is there? For example, when we started to use electronic forms and everything, they were like copies of the original paper forms, but not anymore. And this is a similar transformation that we have to go through with our working practices, to learn new things and to be open, and hopefully see that there are examples around that we can use even in the government, and even in my government, in case of anybody's government. So I think that we have to learn from each other. This is a very, very strong vision for the future. Thank you.
Marta, the Serbian experience, what's here to stay? What's normal business procedure now as a result of the pandemic?
Besides being digital and digitalizing everything, and just taking the papers out of the picture, at least for all forms, applications that are going to be very soon in the next year changed with digital forms, like all of them, like thousands of them. That's the ambitious task that we have. And the data-driven, this is something that we will keep. Decisions making based on data, this is something that helped us a lot during the pandemics in order to design to create the measures based on the different data about the mobility, about the number of patients, about the situation, about the economic strength of certain sectors. We will keep the speed of reaction, the agility, and the incremental innovation, like step-by-step innovating, trying, experimenting. We'll try to keep the innovation dynamics. That was really impressive. We'll keep some of the teleworking, although it's not traditional here in those parts of the world, in the Mediterranean, let's say, and Balkans. So we still are we're still going to our offices. For example, myself, I never stopped. I never ever stopped. I wasn't at least, I mean, I was working all the time from the office. We are going to use more consultation. That's something that is really important, because we are trying to kind of deformalize the consultation process that used to be very formal now, but we've understand that without involving everybody in the table, without designing bottom-up solutions, we would never be successful. So collaboration inside the government, government and society, and between governments, between nations, this is for sure something that we will keep. Basically, the innovation and the collaboration are the key messages and let's say the key takeaways from the crisis so far.
Well, that sounds like quite a lot of change. And I think, one of the things I realized with this question is that I am putting you all in the unfair position of telling me what the future is going to look like, which is, predictions are always a dangerous game. So we won't come back and call you out on this, but I'll be watching to see, in the next, all of us will be in the next 5 or 10 years, whether this holds true, whether there is this reversion to the mean. But all the things you're saying, digitalization, consulting more, this is sort of a dream come true for those who have been calling for this for so long. I guess it reflects in part, as you say, the enthusiasm that some of your colleagues are now bringing to the table. Robert, I'd like to hear your perspective on this question.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I agree with much of what my colleagues have said, so I won't go through those points again. I think the whole question of the workplace of the future. So in Dublin, where I am at the moment, since March, the vast majority of civil service employees, or the vast majority of office workers in Dublin, have been working from home. There's very little activity in the city centre, and I don't think we will go back to the way we were. I think we will have a blended approach where some colleagues will work some days from home and some days in the office. I don't think we're going to go back to the time where people were in the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, or whatever it was. I don't think that will return. Obviously, we'll have more office working than we have now, but it won't go back to the way it was. The question, of course, what does that mean for public transport planning? What does it mean for how we use urban space? What does it mean for planning generally in our cities? I have no idea, but we all, of course, are starting to think about this. Like, we now have cycleways. It's starting to look like Finland now, or Helsinki, all the cycleways that we have in Dublin. It's incredible. We're literally kilometre after kilometre of cycleways are appearing, where in the past there was terrible objections by motorists and others for these innovative ways of moving people around. So just in terms of the urban space, it'll be very different, Amanda, but of course you're right, we don't know, but we need to start thinking about how it could be different and starting to make decisions. The final issue I would mention is in relation to the health system. Like, we've had to increase our capacity. I think that higher capacity will remain. We've had to build test and tracing systems. I think that they will remain, at least the bones of an infrastructure to respond to future crises will remain. And we are now all going to have to embark on the largest immunization programs that we've done in the developed world for generations, several generations. And in a way which I think is going to be very different, because it looks as if we're going to have several different types of vaccines, which will require us to understand how they react and to know what vaccines people have received, and to have a system of data which is more sophisticated than we've had in the past. So I think cities will be different, and our health system will be fundamentally different. A final comment, and I think this is raised already by colleagues. We obsess a lot about risk, and we have risk registers, and we sort of think, okay, once we have a risk register done, we don't have to worry about risk. And I think we do need to spend more time on foresight, which is different. And I think this is something the OECD have pioneered, and I think it's worthwhile us all devoting time to sort of scenario planning in a complete left field way about what the future would look like. And I think we're all going to have to invest more in foresight, which is different, of course, to risk. Thank you.
Terry, jump on in.
Thanks, Amanda. I know we've all talked about work from home, or as we're sort of calling it, work from anywhere. And I do think that's going to persist, but I'm excited to think about some of the changes that will drive in other practices. For example, how much we deal with classified information, what has to be classified, what has to be dealt with in a classified environment. How do we do that in a remote work situation? So I think that will be a follow-on from the remote work conversation, along with how do we evaluate performance when you're used to seeing everyone in the office all day long in person. How do we think about how we evaluate personnel performance in government positions? And also, I think it's forcing a recognition about the absolute essential nature of reliable and affordable childcare. That just being at home, if you have children, does not obviate the need for childcare. And so it's causing us to think differently about some of our social structures around work. I think to points that Juhani and Marta raised about digitalization, the application of artificial intelligence and machine augmentation is really picking up some speed. And so we've seen a massive implementation of chatbots as a way to both reduce the queuing time for services, especially when you can't go in person, to relieve the work and allow the humans to transition to more higher value work. But also where we're seeing falling revenue, especially in our state and local governments, chatbots and artificial intelligence are a way to augment the workforce. So I think that's going to persist, especially as we work our way through the next stages of the economic impacts of the pandemic. And then I would emphasize Robert's point there about risk management. I think this is going to be a heyday for folks in the enterprise risk management space. Again, I don't know how long we'll be able to devote our full attention to that, but I think we're really going to see it rise. But one of the other things that I think is really important that we're seeing in the United States is a systematic appreciation of the impact of social and racial justice in our inherent government programs. And especially at the local levels where they can make faster change, we're seeing a new appreciation of the considerations of social and racial justice in how our programs are actually structured, regardless of whether there's intentional discrimination or not. And people kind of going back to the roots of programs to see how we need to adjust the structure of government programs for more equitable outcomes. And I really do think that is going to persist. It may be harder to have that conversation in our national levels, but at the state and local levels, we are seeing a real move to that focus and assessment of programs. And so I'm really optimistic that will drive long-term change in how we structure and administer our government programs.
Thank you, Terry. That's fascinating. I mean, I think points to the somewhat silver lining of this situation we're in, which is that it's sort of been, opened up very vividly insight into sort of systemic and longstanding problems with how we've structured our government, structured our programs, and opens up that opportunity to remedy those challenges and those issues going forward. This brings me to my third question for the panelists, which is really around what are the warning signs we're seeing now, which suggest that actually government might not be up to making these changes. So we know that the pandemic has done a very good job of illuminating what needs to change in government, or highlighting what we've always known was problematic in how the state is designed and delivers programs and services. But where are the kind of red flags to say we're not up for this challenge? So capacity constraints and really challenges for delivering on future crises. Robert mentioned, for example, foresight as a capacity that most governments have not invested in. So I'm curious about what other capacity constraints you see. I'll pass it over to Marta to take this question first.
What we have seen so far is that leadership and strategic vision, and then political and financial support and human capital were crucial, in order to, let's say, easily go through this crisis. And what we see, it was really a strong vision. In Serbia, especially by the president and the prime minister, and they were running and leading the country in an impressive way. One thing to be concerned about, it's not a concern, but it's, let's say, something that I have observed is that no government can go faster if the society cannot follow. So in terms of digitalization, the digital literacy is something that we have to deal with additionally. And again, the digital accessibility. So as a result of this situation, while we were, let's say, introducing online education, and we were really fast at that. So like it was a Friday afternoon when we declared a state of emergency and we closed schools. Then next Monday, the schooling was totally online. But not all the children have computers at home. So then we have to provide some computers and some internet connections for them. So those kind of fine things that the society in certain cases was not really prepared. But in terms of, let's say, the public administration and their response to this, given the limitation that we had and the lockdowns and medical issues, because many of the civil servants get infected by the COVID, and the scarce resources that we have, and that the new territory for everyone, the environment that was hostile, I think that everybody maxed their role.
Thank you, Marta. Great to open up the conversation by highlighting that this isn't just a question of capacity in the public sector, but also more broadly at a societal level. Terry, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this question around capacity constraints that we might want to be concerned about going forward.
Sure. Our system of federalism is really complex, and it defaults to sort of local solutions. And so where you live matters in how your community is able to respond to these. So usually that's a great thing. You're living with people who are sort of like-minded and you're happy there, but where you live matters in terms of some other things, right? So one of the things that we've been challenged with is the equitable and efficient distribution of aid funds, because when we finally released, a massive stimulus package from the federal level, it flows to the state governments, then it flows to local governments, then it flows to nonprofit and private sector partners, and ultimately down to the individual. And not all of those flow pipes are the same size, and they don't all flow with the same efficiency. So we've struggled in many places to have an efficient distribution of those aid funds. And so people perceive different levels of support and assistance. So that's one thing. I think to Marta's point, our public education sector has been absolutely upended by this crisis. Both access to broadband, access to social support networks. Our public education system is actually a critical source of food security for some of our poorer communities. And when that is remote, the closure of public schools impacts children's well-being in lots of different ways. And so again, where you live matters. Do you have access to broadband? Do you have access to computers? Are you digitally literate? How does that affect how your social networks? I mean, that public schools are a source of childcare, they're a source of food, they are a support system for so much of our society. And that's been really troubling and had an impact on capacity. Of course, the politicization of the response in our country has made it really challenging, whether your community accepts and complies with mitigation protocols, again, how that assistance payment structure works, and even whether you're willing to subscribe to some of those government assistance programs. And so I think all of those about where you live and how you access the assistance programs has an impact on public trust, and how the public trust goes affects the government's ability to respond to the next crisis. So in terms of capacity, I think we have both a flow capacity issue and also a trust capacity issue going forward.
So plenty to keep all the researchers working with NAPA busy for the next 3 decades at least. Robert, your perspective on this question of capacity.
Yeah,
where do you see critical issues?
Yeah, I think trust is, as Terry mentioned, I think trust is really important. I think if the citizens trust government, well, then that external factor can be really important in terms of driving the change in the performance. But I think capacity really needs around people, the right type of people, the right skills, the right motivation, and I think to an extent, this crisis has given public servants a real sense of purpose, though, a common purpose. So I think we're able to attract more of the best people into the public service, and it's seen as a more attractive career, not only because obviously the private sector there's lots of job loss, lots of uncertainty, but I think people do feel we are sort of in this almost a spirit of a collectivist spirit where collective action and community coming together to resolve this great crisis is driving people's perceptions of the public service. So to an extent, we may be able to galvanize and get some more smarter people in to work some of these key jobs in the public sector. I think people will look in some countries, maybe not all, but some countries look at the public sector in a different way now than they would have done before the crisis. So I think that's interesting around people's skills and so on. I think a big issue about our capacity, which we all know about, but is data. How we use the data, how we link the data, how we get the best value from data, how can we use the data to help us make better decisions and also to provide better service to citizens. So I think it's really the external environment is the trust, but I think internally our ability to nurture our people, get the best people in, and how we use data, I think those factors will really drive a lot of our ability to perform into the future.
Juhani, to close off this question, your perspective on capacity constraints that we're facing right now and that we need to remedy to be up to facing this challenge and future ones.
Thank you. I think that the colleagues already said most of the things. I really do think that we are going to solve this problem for years to come, and also it will mean that we don't have all the solutions yet here. There's a lot of innovation that we need even to tackle the things that we have now at our desks. So it will go from administration to administration, government to government, sector to sector, region to region, and so forth. But one thing that I also would like to emphasize here, that we have to be learning continuously, that there is this continuous learning that has to be done. So it's not only when we get new people in to for example, to the government sector, but it's also that we learn ourselves, even in those cases when we are already senior administrators in our government. We have to understand that this learning is needed constantly, and we all have to put our personal efforts to this learning process. Thank you.
Thank you, Juhani. I think we'll shift gears now and move to some of our questions that we've received from those listening in on the panel. And one of the questions that I think should be on all of our minds is the question of sort of funding and financing some of these changes going forward. So one of the participants asks, says, I appreciated Robert's call for values, capacity, ambition, and leadership, and believe this is key to achieving both performance and resilience going into the future. But, the $1 million question, or even more than $1 million, let's be clear, is how to make the budget case for such investments once the urgency recedes. In particular, given that what we saw after one of the last sort of big shocks to governments, the global financial crisis, where many governments chose austerity as the path going forward, and not necessarily the most fertile ground for public sector innovation. Terry, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that question, and any of the other participants who want to jump in, just maybe raise your hand or let me know, and I'll open up the floor to you as well.
Well, thanks, Amanda. This is a really vital question, and I don't think we're going to choose austerity, but I don't think we'll have any choice but austerity. One of the critical questions in the United States is the level of debt that we've incurred, not just in response to this crisis, but sort of where we were going into the crisis. Our national debt is now nearly 100% of our GDP, and our budget flexibility has been steadily decreasing as we have had a policy of reducing taxes but increasing entitlement programs. And so in the absence of either increasing taxes or re-engineering those entitlements, we have very little fiscal flex to address the long-term ramifications of this crisis, much less prepare for the next one, whatever it is. And at the federal level, that's a problem. At our local government levels, we're very concerned. Most of our cities and counties had been building rainy day funds prior to the pandemic, but they're spending those as they're deferring tax payments, as commercial real estate values are going down, and so their property tax bases are going down, and they've had to respond to public health crisis with significant increases. So, I think as we go forward, we're going to be seeing, just because the resources aren't there and the tax base is not going to be there, a massive reduction in our government structure and a massive reorganization in some of our entitlement programs that are going to mitigate against much of an increase in spending. We just don't have the flex to do that unless we get very creative. We can be agile and we can be more efficient, but that's not going to be enough to move the needle on the level of, trillions of dollars that we're going to need to respond. So it is a real problem. It's a real challenge. Back to, needing a crisis to drive change. We can cross our fingers and hope that this really forces a massive reevaluation of some of how our entitlement programs are structured. But that's a really tough political conversation to have.
And as you say, the idea of very few politicians have the courage or interest in raising taxes as one of their sort of overt policy positions. Alex Himmelfarb, former clerk of the Privy Council in Canada, famously wrote a piece called "Tax is a Four-Letter Word," suggesting that raising taxes is just not a part of the political conversation anymore. And so perhaps that is one of the changes that we'll see going forward, or as you say, given budgets have very little wiggle room, if any at all. Do any of our other participants want to jump in on this question of sort of financing and budgeting some of these changes going forward?
Maybe Amanda, just to say, I think many of the changes we're talking about could over time be self-financing, and they could lead to budget changes, not the type of changes that Terry's talking about, which are big policy changes, but some of the more structural changes we're talking about in terms of digitalization, for example, or other reforms, can lead to a payback period, which I think is quite short, actually. So we should be able to construct a reasonable business case. But I think, the fiscal issues that we'll all face, we could spend another hour just on those alone, and we don't have the time, Amanda. It all depends from country to country. Countries that have currencies which are in demand, where people want to hold those currencies, will have flexibility to keep on printing money for the next while. But of course, there will be a day of reckoning that will come to an end. And we face, most OECD countries face severe demographic problems, which will slow down our economies and also increase the cost of age-related entitlements and health requirements. So I think there will be a period of real debate around fiscal priorities. I think it'll be different to what we faced after the economic financial crisis. It'll be different, and the policy response this time around has been very different. But we will face, I think, constraints in the future, and societies will have to debate how to manage those constraints.
Robert, I wonder if you could elaborate. In what way do you see there's sort of differences between the response to the financial crisis and what we're likely to see now? That's an interesting point. I'd like to hear some more about that.
I think that the financial crisis, first of all, citizens blamed governments for failing to regulate banks properly, and then for bailing them out. Whether that's true or not, the perception was that among citizens that governments failed before the crisis, and then the response to crisis heaped the burden of adjustment on ordinary citizens. I'm not saying I believe in that, but that's certainly a perception in our country and many other countries. So I think the public sector had a very bad crisis last time, and I think it really damaged people's confidence in institutions and confidence in politics. And we can see that in many surveys when people are asked about their faith in democracy or institutions, their faith has been damaged. I think this time, Amanda, it's different. I think because obviously this is something which is not, the pathogen was not caused by government. Obviously our behavior in one respect led to it developing, and the way we set up, the way we live our lives, of course, led to its spread. So in that sense it's different. And of course, how the governments have responded, again, we need to see ultimately how citizens view the way in which we've been effective. Like my sense in Ireland, even though people are very unhappy about these rolling lockdowns and the impact it's having on living standards, I think people generally have confidence that the response has been fairly effective, and we're doing as well as we could do. And we shall see in 6 months' time or a year's time, hopefully when we get to a post-COVID or a new COVID situation, how people will assess the performance of government. But I think it's still all to play for. It's still unclear. I think at this stage of the financial crisis, I think we had a pretty good view about how citizens viewed how effective government had become.
Thanks, Robert. That's really interesting. Marta, Juhani, do you have thoughts you'd like to add to this, or we can move to the next question as well? No pressure.
Well, if I say something, I think that one thing is very important, that we have panel discussions like this and venues for this kind of discussion and benchmarking each other and really trying to find common solutions for these things. And during the next year or so, I guess we will all be very much devoted in executing all the different recovery projects and everything. So I truly hope that we have enough time to really think about these matters that were just identified by the two previous speakers. So I think that this is really on us, so that we will take this challenge also, not only execute the things that we now have at our hands.
Marta?
Just one, let's say, short thought about this. What we have seen in Serbia is that the government basically set the ground as if they were expecting something like this by focusing a lot and putting too much effort and all, let's say, the aces on the digital, on the technology. So tech is one of the highest growing sectors in Serbia, and it takes like 6% of the GDP, which is more than construction and more than agriculture. And now in this period, you see, because there is a growth in the tech sector, basically, so the entire economy is going well. And really good fiscal and monetary smart, let's say, measures which were designed together with the private sector, with the chambers of commerce, led to a situation where we have the projections that by the end of this year, we'll have the smallest, let's say, decrease in the GDP, which will go below 0.5 percentage. So it will be one of the smallest in Europe. So, you know, the policies that have been designed prior to the crisis, but were, let's say, some kind of very actual and very relevant for the modern times design, let's say, kind of proved us to be in a position to not, let's say, to suffer that much.
Great. Thank you, Marta. I mean, the next question I actually would like to pose to all the panelists, because I think it's a really good one that will help, I think, focus us in on specifically what we can do in civil service organizations going forward. So I think the conversation has touched on sort of broader policy changes, questions around sort of societal shifts and systemic changes we need to see more broadly, but focusing in on sort of how we run our governments, how we run our civil service institutions, which is in many ways where the conversation began. I think this question from one of our audience members is great. And so it asks, which administrative habits should be decommissioned after this great 6-month detox period? So it'd be great to hear from you if you had to name sort of 1 or 2 tendencies or habits or behaviors or attitudes that we see amongst public servants and amongst political leaders. What should be gone? I'll take moderator privilege here and say that if I had to pick one that just needs to be decommissioned now, it's signing on to multi-year, largely outsourced large IT projects. I think that if we're talking about deliverables and IT projects that we don't see for a year or 2, those need to just go away, because I think this pandemic has made us realize how shorter term deliverables on digital lead to greater success, and to Robert's cost can really manage the cost of IT projects, and maybe that's where we find some slack in our budgets going forward. So Juhani, I'll put you on the spot here to go first. Which administrative habits would you like to see decommissioned after this period?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that we have to learn away from. And first of all, I think that we have to learn ending things. we usually are not very good we are very good at starting things, but we have to learn ending things. And this is one thing that, of course, is probably not because of this crisis, but this crisis really sort of emphasizes the fact that we are not very good at least in Finland, in the public sector, we are not very good at ending things. We have to learn ending. I think that the example that you gave is also about ending things. And this is one of the things that it's not very easy. It's not very easy at all. And of course, there are a lot of things that we have to learn not to work in the silos and everything like that. But ending things, I'd put it this way. Thanks.
Excellent. Robert.
Yeah, I would agree about ending things. Deprioritizing, can we actually say, okay, we're not going to do that anymore, and that's no longer a priority? Because we think we have too many priorities, and by definition, you have to have a limit on priorities, or else they're not a priority. But I think that's a good point. I agree with. I think I would like us to be more. I would like us to be less risk averse. I'd like us to be more entrepreneurial. Take balance risks, and that requires a cultural change in our civil service, but it also requires a cultural change in the media and in political discourse. And I just, even in my more optimistic moments, I don't think this age of outrage and emotion and irrationality is going to go away anytime soon. So I'm not optimistic about that, but I think if we had a little bit more sanity and perspective on political debates, well, then we could have public servants who can take more sensible risks, and we focus more on learning about things going wrong, as opposed to, as I mentioned previously, the whole gotcha culture, which is a problem. So I guess that's what I would hope for, man.
Thanks, Robert. Definitely something that comes up time and time again in my research when I speak to public servants, and not to be a sort of an apologist for maybe inaction, but often it's this point, it's hard to be entrepreneurial when the greatest fear in government is seeing your minister's name splashed across the front of the newspaper for some mistake you made. So thank you for that. I'm sure many public servants are cheering right now at you highlighting the role of the media and gotcha culture in limiting innovation. Marta, and then we'll move to Terry for the final thought.
Well, long cycles of policy making and policy adoption. We should opt for smart policy making, for incremental policies that will probably change completely the legislation process and the policy creation process, but we have to speed it up. It is too slow.
Well, Amanda, I'll shoot a little smaller on this one, but our culture of public service is lifetime career. Sort of, you join the government and that's where you work for the rest of your life. And I think one of the things we've talked about here is that is inside the government fence, a culture of stasis, and risk aversion. And so one of the things that we've been having a conversation about here is how we can build a service model that allows people to move back and forth between government service and service in the private sector. And I think if we can do that in a way that allows people to sort of not lose position as they go back and forth, we'll be able to better innovate and cross those boundaries, as Juhani said earlier, bring private sector innovation into the government, share government practices and concerns with the private sector, and build a stronger partnership model that might help us both introduce some higher levels of risk tolerance, but also have a more permeable barrier for innovation portability.
Thank you, Terry. That's excellent. Interestingly, in Canada, everyone assumes that this happens all the time. In the United States, we're always talking about how we have to become more like you and allowing interchanges. So I'll have to follow up on that. Maybe that's a myth we need to bust in Canada. The grass is always greener on the other side, as they say. For the closing question to our panelists, I'd like to give each of you a minute to respond to a question that every speaker in the GovAfterShock event is being asked to respond to. And this will feed into a call to action that I mentioned will be developed by the Office of Public Sector Innovation within the OECD. So the question for you is, what are you personally committed to doing differently in light of what has been revealed by the crisis? So I'll just go right across the panel as I see it. So we'll go back to Terry and begin with Terry. What is your personal commitment moving forward?
Well, Amanda, it's both my personal commitment and my commitment of the National Academy of Public Administration, and that is to work with our public administrators at all levels to help them address social and racial equity issues in the policy programs. And so oftentimes that means sort of getting back to basics in assistance programs and thinking about how they're structured, how they are actually practiced, and what their outcomes are. So that is a huge commitment of ours and of mine personally going forward.
Thank you, Terry. Juhani, your personal commitment going forward, please.
Well, this is very personal, but I really would like to use this opportunity to lower my carbon footprint and also increase my carbon handprint. And this is something that where I want to put my efforts into. And of course, this is very much coming from my background as a permanent secretary at the Ministry of Environment.
Thank you, Juhani. That's a topic we didn't get into, but definitely an important potential opportunity that the crisis poses for all of us. Robert, your personal commitment moving forward.
I don't know, maybe personally committed to getting a new job, maybe, or getting some holiday time when we're allowed. I don't know. I think it's about sort of maybe personally thinking about leadership and nurturing the next generation of leaders. I think it's something that so like many colleagues on the call and on the panel, you know, we're leading organizations, but do we spend enough time nurturing the next generation? Because these organizations are really important in our societies, and do we spend enough time investing in the future, investing in the leaders of the future? So maybe that's what I think I'll personally be committing to do more of in the future.
Thank you, Robert. And Marta, for the final thought from our panel, what is your personal commitment moving forward after this crisis?
My personal commitment is to work even more with the Serbian National Academy for Public Administration, the counterpart of Teresa Academy, on instilling innovation culture. So I think that we have to kind of influence the mindset of the people working for the government. Otherwise, we are not going to be flexible and cope with the future, which is, I don't know, still blurred for us.
Thank you very much. I'd like to offer sincere gratitude to all of our panelists for taking the time to come here today. It is one of the great things that is coming out of this really unfortunate situation is that we can bring together people from around the world to focus on the immediate crisis, but also, as we did today, I think importantly, what we can learn and moving forward. I think it was really interesting to see the kind of coherence and convergence in concerns across jurisdictions presented today, but also some important variation in where different countries and different organizations are placing the focus. So there's plenty to follow up on here and many things we'll be watching going forward. I hope those who participated in the audience, and I thank them very much for their questions and engagement with the poll. I hope that they gained some insight going forward, and I think there'll be lots for us to keep talking about. This session has been recorded and will be posted on the GovAfterShock site event after. So if anybody wants to follow up and pick up on some of the points that we talked about today, it'll be available there for you. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to the OECD for hosting this conversation, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Bye-bye.
Bye all. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It was a really great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to meet you virtually. I wish we could get together in person.
Yeah, stay healthy.
Paris next year.
Yes.